Next, we'll be hearing from Alan Phillips. He'll be discussing vaccine rights and the EEOC. Alan is a vaccine rights attorney licensed in North Carolina. His practice is exclusively confined to federal law issues and North Carolina state law unless advising another attorney. He is also the host and producer of a weekly radio program, Vaccine Agenda. Thank you for joining us, Alan.
All right, I'm going to, this is the issue, you just heard what this is all about. So I'm going to move into some information. This is about people's lives. And I don't know any justification for the kind of story you just heard and the stories we've heard today, money or anything else. I don't know anything that justifies this. We need to understand that there is a subset of the human species that lacks a conscience and that can make decisions that none of us would make. And some of these people are intellectual giants. Some of these people are academically or intellectually brilliant, and they get into important decision-making positions. And as long as they're not held responsible for the outcome, they can make decisions based on money or other agendas. This is fundamental to the issue that we're dealing with, recognizing that these kind of people exist. Now, many people who further the agenda don't even realize they're doing it, they're following orders, or even if they do realize they're doing it, they're trapped. I can't afford to lose my job, I have to do what I'm told, I have to give the shot or get the shot, or I know it doesn't make sense, but, or whatever. So a lot of us are powerless as individuals, no judgment on my part, of any specific individual. But as long as we allow the fear of whatever it is, losing our job, being kicked out of school, whatever the situation is, as long as the fear controls us, they control us, the agenda goes forward. This is not something that's happened by accident. This has been a very carefully devised and calculated plan that is decades old. We are decades behind the learning curve in understanding what's been going on and catching up to what's going on. But we have to do that in order to be able to deal with this effectively. So we're dealing with systems of control. We're dealing with a world run by psychopaths. And by that, I'm not diagnosing anyone. I just mean people who lack a conscience but can otherwise are very intelligent and can make decisions. And they sleep perfectly well at night knowing that people are unnecessarily being killed and injured by vaccines and many other controversies we could say similar things to about in today's world. This is a graph. There's just a little background information, kind of broad information here. Each column is a year from the left, 2001, 2017 on the right. Each separate block is a pharmaceutical fine, combined criminal civil fine that was $100 million or more. There are 55 of them. This comes from the Justice Department website. It's not a conspiracy theory. Not that that phrase to me personally is an automatic reason for ruling anything out. But this comes right off the federal government Justice Department website. I found 55 of these fines, $100 million and greater. There have been billion-dollar criminal fines for whatever good the pharmaceutical industry gives us, and I don't see it as a black and white issue. They're not all good or all bad, but this is a criminal cartel. They would not keep engaging in this kind of behavior. Now, civil fines you can get if you make an accident, you're still responsible if you don't do something on purpose. You don't get a criminal fine unless you knew you were violating a criminal law and you did it anyway. There has to be that conscious, deliberate intent for it to be criminal conviction, criminal fine. So they know they're violating criminal laws. It's a number on a spreadsheet at the end of the day. They calculate it. They don't like paying billion-dollar fines, but there have been fines this high. The largest one I know, individual fine, $3 billion, $1 billion criminal, $2 billion civil. This is part of business. It's a calculated risk. They wouldn't keep doing it unless there was a net profit. There was even one instance where a company was assessed an $800 and something million fine, and they complained about it. We can't afford that. Okay, well, they lowered it to $200 million so they could afford it. It's not that they're happy to pay fines, but it's part of doing business. And there's obviously a net profit or they wouldn't keep engaging in the behavior. So this is a huge piece of the problem we're dealing with. This is just a cumulative graph of the VAERS reports from 1990, 2016. A lot of ups and downs, but the overall trend from bottom left to upper right is pretty clear. As more and more vaccines are administered, more and more reports are made. Almost 560,000 total, almost 70,000 classified as serious, 2% disabilities, 1% deaths. But let's put this in perspective. Now, there are multiple sources for this same or similar information, but this comes from the Department of Health and Human Services in 2011, a report, fewer than 1% of vaccine adverse events are reported. So that, what was the number, 560,000 or something? Is that really 5 million? Is it really 50 million? We don't know. This is a graph. Each column is a year for the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program payouts. Those horizontal lines are 50 million, 100 million, 150, 200, 250, 300. You can see the largest single year payout, fiscal year 2017, the one on the far right, $282 million. And then the next highest one was 2013. I think it was around 276 million. There was a drop in the middle here, but overall, again, there's a trend from lower left to upper right. As more and more vaccines are administered, more and more payouts occur. And that 282 million last year, again, if that's less than 1%, I don't know if that number applies here, but is it really 2.8 billion or 28 billion? If you can, measure injury and death with dollars. So let's get a little more focused here. This is from CDC website, flu vaccine coverage among healthcare personnel. 2010-11 season on the left all the way up to the dashed line underneath is in November. The solid line on top is March of the same season. So the 2010-11 season, 2011-12 season, and so forth there. The numbers you can see roughly 10% higher coverage by the end of the flu season as compared to the beginning of the flu season. But it's in the 60, 70% range just generally. Reasons that healthcare workers said that they got the vaccine. The biggest reason at the top, to protect myself from the flu. The second one, because it was mandatory or I had to for work. And I hear this all the time in my work. I've worked with hundreds of healthcare workers, probably give or take around 500 healthcare workers all over the country, helping them legally avoid flu shots at work. And one of the stories I hear over and over and over again is, the first thing they say, of course, is how do I legally avoid the flu shot? And the second thing they say is, and there's 5 other people in my department who don't want the shot either, but they're afraid to even ask for an exemption, so they just go ahead and get it. Or they don't want to wear a mask. I'll talk about mask policies in a little bit. A huge percentage of people who get the flu shot get it because they have to. Now they're opening up the adult market. They're starting with the healthcare workers because you guys are all the role model for the rest of the country. The Department of Health and Human Services Healthy People 2020 initiative, they plan to get 90% of healthcare workers vaccinated annually with a flu shot by 2020, and 80% of the rest of us, if that makes you healthcare workers feel any better. They're starting with the flu shot because there's the most money there. Everybody from 6 months old to 6 months post-mortem is supposed to get a flu shot. Let me come back to this. To protect myself because it was mandatory. So many people are getting shots because they have to, not because they think, because they want to. In fact, many who don't want it are getting it because they feel like they have to and don't see a way out of it. Reasons that they said they didn't want the shot. I might experience side effects or get sick from the vaccine. That's actually the largest specific individual category. I do not need the vaccine. It's the second one. The third one, I think the ingredients in the vaccine are not good for me. Now, I'm not sure I see a big difference between those first 3, especially the first one and the third one. I think it's kind of interesting that they separated them out, maybe to try to make them look a little less serious. And I notice they don't mention religious objections at all here, so I assume that's in part of the bottom one that says any other reason. But I'll tell you, if you want to qualify for a religious exemption to a vaccine at work, you specifically do not want to mention anything about concern about adverse effects or anything medical or scientific, because by definition, in terms of the way the law works, religion and science are mutually exclusive realms. So if you say, I want a religious exemption because I'm afraid the vaccine is going to hurt me, you just blew your religious exemption out of the water. So I think it's impossible to really get reliable statistics on the reasons that people don't want shots, because the ones who understand that are maybe they have a really strong concern about potential adverse effects, but maybe they're not going to mention that because they don't want to undermine their right to get a religious exemption. But interesting nonetheless. These are somewhat dated graphs from 2009, but the one on the left talks about mortality from influenza. Let me see if I can even, I think it's 1953 to 33 to 65, I think. You can see that there is this precipitous drop in influenza deaths, and then you see the little arrow pointing off screen when the vaccine was first in widespread use in the United States. So this is something we see at least similar with virtually all the childhood infectious diseases, that there was a drop in mortality on the order of 90-95% before the vaccines were ever even introduced. So when we're told that vaccines save millions of lives each year in the US, I'm rather skeptical of that, because I haven't seen any real evidence that the vaccines are the reasons that the mortality rates dropped in the first place. So why would getting the vaccines be what's keeping that mortality from coming back? The other one is kind of a concern. Under age 5, influenza deaths, and you see that there's somewhat of a drop, and this is, again, I think it was and somebody help me out here, 1999 to 2003, is that? Anyway, there's this jump where after it's dropping and almost level there before the jump, and then there's this huge jump, and that was right after they started. Now the graph mistakenly says that the CDC mandated the flu shot for children. The CDC doesn't have authority to mandate vaccines for any state residents, but they recommended the vaccine, and there was a significant uptake of vaccine in children at that point. Seemed to have a counterproductive result, or at least a correlation. A little bit about influenza and the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. This comes right off of the federal government website figures. You can crunch the numbers a little bit and come up with this. A 10-year period from 2006 through 2016, 11-year period, about 1.4 billion doses of the influenza vaccine were distributed during those 11 years. That's 44% of all vaccines that were distributed, again, because it's the only vaccine that people are recommended to get every year and throughout your life. There were 2,714 petitions filed seeking payment for injury or death, influenza. That's 52% of all of the VICP petitions. It's very disproportionate. 44% of the vaccines are influenza vaccines, but 52% of the petitions are for influenza. That doesn't necessarily mean that the influenza vaccine is more reactive. It may be that because there's, there could be any number of reasons. You know, there's a real push, particularly healthcare workers, but the adult population with flu shots. And as somebody said, and in the spirit of even bad humor can sometimes be a helpful coping mechanism, the difference between a newborn infant who has a vaccine reaction and a 30-year-old is that the 30-year-old has a Facebook page and they're going to tell everybody about it. Federal law requires handing out the vaccine information statement, as you heard people talking about earlier, but they don't do that. And so people don't know that there's an injury compensation program. Parents, young parents in particular, if the pediatrician doesn't hand out that statement, they don't know about it. I've had people, I don't do injury cases myself, there are about 130 attorneys in the country that do that. There's only one attorney in the country whose practice is focused solely on vaccine exemptions and waivers, and I work with clients and attorneys around the country on a wide variety of different issues. But it may be that there's just better awareness in the influenza adverse event population, vaccine adverse event population there is with the other vaccines. I don't know, but disproportionate. And this is also interesting. Over that 11-year period, the influenza petitions that were compensated, 87% of them were compensated compared to only 68% of all vaccines. Now that 68% figure includes the influenza, so that's kind of a skewed figure. You can't use that as a gauge for vaccines generally not counting influenza. And over the lifetime of the program, the compensation rate is around 31%. So influenza vaccines represent a disproportionately high percentage of the petitions, a disproportionately high percentage of compensated petitions. And petitions per dose, about 1.5 million, but if really that's only 1% of what's getting reported, or less than 1%, could it be more than 1 in 5,000? And somebody was saying 1 in 4,000, the last speaker, so that's same ballpark as this figure here. Now, I had a medical doctor as a client a couple of years ago, and the official story, as I understand it, is that, yes, we admit that flu shots cause GBS, but it's 1 in a million, maybe 1 in 2 million. Well, this doctor, client of mine, said he had 4 patients in his practice that had flu vaccine-induced GBS, and 3 of them died. So you're damned right he's on the phone with me saying, how do I get out of this? And I don't think he had 4 million patients to get his 4 GBS patients. This is another one of those, kind of simple, cold and hard facts in a massively complex issue. We're all being lied to. And the difference between somebody being able to hear us and not hearing us is what flips the switch. When somebody recognizes there's an issue here, there's a problem, is when they realize they've been lied to. There's any number of ways specifically that any given person may come to that awareness. But that's really what it boils down to. Now, this is a law firm that does vaccine injury cases. I don't know the attorneys, I don't have any relationship with them. They just happen to post their stuff on the internet, and so I pull them up as an example. They post their settled cases. So from December of 2010 to May of 2017, 6.5 years, they had 481 cases that they posted. Here's the money we got for our cases. Influenza cases were 64% of them. GBS, Guillain-Barré syndrome, was 87% of their influenza vaccine cases. And there were 14 deaths in these 481 cases that they dealt with. 14 of those were deaths. They were all influenza vaccine deaths, and 12 of them were GBS. Let's talk a little bit more about exemptions specifically. This is just a real quick summary of what I work with in my practice. I help people legally avoid vaccines required at birth for daycare and grade school. There are different subcategories there: public schools, private schools, home schools, military schools. College enrollment, there's a subset there in healthcare curriculums, med students, nursing students, EMT training, other things. Any place where somebody has to do work in a clinical site. The clinical sites require vaccines, and the state exemption law doesn't help you there. Federal civil rights law can help, but it's a different category. Military, not only military members, but if they're transporting the family overseas, they have to get vaccinated. So do civilian employees, contractors with the military. Immigrants, including foreign adopted children and refugees. What I call vaccine custody disputes, where parents divorce, separate, split up, disagree about vaccinating kids. Turns out the way the law works with vaccines in custody cases, completely different from every other thing that comes up in custody cases, and family law attorneys in courts don't see that. So I've talked with over 100 family law attorneys around the country, and the vast majority, none of them have ever known what I had to share with them before I talked to them. And I'm not smarter than any of them. I just happen to be the only one in the country who's been immersed in this issue for many years, and things gradually dawn on you even if you're a little slow like I can be. If you're immersed in it, things will, come to your attention. But the vast majority of them have said, wow, I never thought about that, but I hear what you're saying. That makes sense. So it's heartening to be able to share, information with people that most of them hear, understand, get it, and feel like they can use. Nevertheless, those cases are very difficult to win because judges don't like leaving kids unvaccinated. And they don't really care what the law says many times. Go ask the appellate court, maybe they'll follow the law here, but not in my court. So you have to have the right arguments to win those cases. But then you have to have a judge who's willing to do what the law says and not feel responsible for a result that most of us here would know would be the result of a misunderstanding of the whole issue in the first place. Of course, international travel and emergencies. Department of Health and Human Services, Healthy People 2020, 90% of healthcare workers annually with a flu shot by 2020, 80% of non-institutionalized adults. I have no idea where that phrase comes from. You know as much as I do now about that, but that's in their goals. Most states do not have state exemption laws that apply to employees. The state exemption laws applies to kids in school and daycare and college enrollment. But there are 6 or 7 states that do have a state law for medical exemption, 3 with religious, and Maine even has a philosophical exemption. I never have healthcare worker clients from Maine. This falls under federal civil rights law, the part of that law that's called Title VII, which prohibits discrimination in the workplace. It applies to public and private employers with 15 or more employees. And if you request an exemption, I don't think they're obligated by law to offer a religious exemption, but if you request one, that triggers their obligation to provide what the law calls a reasonable accommodation. There are several different issues that come up. The employment arena is just sort of fraught with multiple legal problems. I'm not sure why, but I see this with hospitals all over the country. The vast majority of them implement a policy requiring clergy support. You don't have to be a member of an organized religion at all. You could literally be the only person on the planet with your specific religious beliefs, and if they meet the legal definition, then this is not about government dictating religion. Our legal system protects religious beliefs and practices, but in order to do that, there has to be some kind of a line somewhere, some kind of a definition. Otherwise, everything would be a protected religious belief, and that wouldn't make any sense. So on the one hand, it's incredibly broad. You don't have to belong to any organized system of beliefs. It doesn't matter if you do. You can be any religion, no religion, any mixture of religions, but you have to meet the legal definition of religion. And most people's common sense approach gets them into trouble to one degree or another, as I see it. I spend hours in consultations explaining this in detail, but the good news is it's incredibly broad as a starting point, and you have to avoid things like beliefs about science or medicine or politics and philosophy. But it's really, really broad beyond. It doesn't even require a belief in a Western theological God. So it's incredibly broad as a starting point, but there are a number of what I refer to as legal pitfalls that have to be avoided. Many times they'll create a form, but then they'll say things like, you understand that you're going to kill everybody if you don't get a vaccine. I'm only exaggerating a little bit here. And it turns out that actually violates constitutional free speech for your employer to require you to agree with their view of reality. But this is common practice in a lot of hospitals around the country. The other issue I see all the time, face mask policies, and there's a wide range of different kinds of policies that I've seen around the country, but most of them require that you wear a face mask based solely on the fact that you didn't get a flu shot. In my opinion, that blatantly violates federal civil rights law. I have an 18-page legal argument where I lay out 6 different ways that Title VII is violated, but it boils down to 2 really simple ideas. The CDC has even said this in a formal legal publication called the Federal Register back during the so-called swine flu pandemic. Face masks do not block or filter viruses out of the air. Take a fishing net down to the beach and try to scoop up sand with it. I mean, that's if it's got holes big enough to breathe through it. Viruses are incredibly tiny. If a virus was the size of the smallest thing you can see with the naked eye, then a basketball would have a circumference of 2,500 feet, half a mile circumference. That's how small viruses are. So if there's a hole big enough for you to breathe through in a mask, it's not going to block or filter viruses out of the air. What the CDC says is the masks block the larger droplet particles from a cough or sneeze, not even the smaller particles, not clumps of viruses, not individual viruses, the larger droplet particles. You wear a mask where you or the patient have symptoms and you're close to each other. Nobody wants to be coughed or sneezed on. It's an etiquette issue. It's not a stop the spread of influenza. But there's something fascinating about flu viruses that most people don't realize. They are uniquely and brilliantly intelligent. If there are some flu viruses on a doorknob and say a healthcare worker reaches out to grab the doorknob in a hospital, if they have had a flu shot or are wearing a face mask, the viruses can actually detect that. They will jump off the doorknob before the healthcare worker's hand hits the doorknob. But if you haven't had your shot or not wearing a mask, they'll jump on your hand, you'll get infected, you'll spread the flu to everybody. So we think these policies are crazy, but no, they actually make perfect sense. Just a comment about legislation. This is where, it's a science issue ultimately, of course. Are vaccines safe? Are they effective? Do they work? Is there a place for them? But our day-to-day interface is a legal matter. Legislation is critical, and the federal government does not have authority to mandate vaccines for state residents, so a lot of important stuff goes on at the federal level, but the state legislatures are the primary battleground here. That's where rights are won or lost. You guys know that. That's why we're here today. But legislative activism is a crucial part of all of this. In the way of resources, Dr. Sherry Tenpenny has a vaccine research library. She's constantly, she and her staff, finding studies and adding to this. Last I heard, over 7,000 peer-reviewed published medical studies documenting vaccine failure and harm. This is not an unusual thing that never shows up in the literature. I have a website, vaccinerights.com, lots of free information there. I have an ebook that I charge for, The Authoritative Guide to Vaccine Legal Exemptions, explains how our legal systems work generally and then talks about exemptions in all the different areas I mentioned earlier. Beware of the internet. There's a lot of blind leading the blind. Worse, there are what I call disinformation agents who pretend to be on our side, who are specifically working to undermine us from the inside out. It's a very effective technique. And there are a lot of different ways they do that, but the bottom line is they try to distract or confuse us, give us bad information, give us a false sense of security so that we are either ineffective or not even trying to be effective. Weekly radio show on blogtalkradio.com/The Vaccine Agenda, but the archives of the show are available at the same website and also a YouTube Vaccine Rights channel. You can email me for the web address for that at attorney@vaccinerights.com. Join the NVIC advocacy portal if you're not already a member of that. They track vaccine legislation in the states around the country and at the federal level as well. A couple of quick closing thoughts. Quote from Ron Paul, former U.S. Congressman in Texas: "Freedom over one's physical person is the most basic freedom of all, and people in a free society should be sovereign over their own bodies. When we give government the power to make medical decisions for us, we in essence accept that the state owns our bodies." And this is not acceptable, of course, and we need to keep declaring that. And as good buddies in California said, we will not go away. And persistence is what's going to win this race. And a quick closing quote from a buddy of mine I went to high school with a few years ago. "It is the first responsibility of every citizen to question authority." Question authority. I encourage you to do that. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions informally later.